Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 5, recorded May 2018. This is the Trek Profiles Podcast, where each episode we sit down with a Star Trek fan. We learn their story and we try to figure out why the show matters to them, to you, and to all of us. I am John, your intrepid host of this whole enterprise, and I welcome you to this, the Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 5. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can reach us at feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at TrekProfiles. If you wish to leave us a voicemail, you can leave a message at our automated voicemail line at 609-512-LLAP. That's 609-512-5527. Warning, as we record this, we have reached the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, so all previous Trek content up to and including that point is fair game and may be discussed during this episode. You have been warned, human. My co-host is the amazing, talented, and slightly devious M5 Multitronic unit. Say hello, M5.
M5 Multitronic unit, all systems available and at your command.
Show me all the incoming communications, M5.
Messages now displayed on the main console.
The Trek Profiles Podcast is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network. As we get into the summer, one show that might interest you is Shore Leave, which is on our network. It originally focused on the Star Trek Las Vegas convention experience, but now has expanded to cover lots of other Trek conventions. In particular, if you've never been to STLV, which is the Las Vegas one, I'd recommend their STLV 101 series, which is a great overview for new attendees. You can find out more about Shore Leave and all the other amazing Tricorder Transmission shows at www.thetricordertransmissions.com. If you enjoy this or any of the other shows on the network and you wish to support us, you may do so through Patreon, where support gets you quicker access to unedited episodes, Patreon hangouts, and some other benefits, another couple of which will be announced shortly. Another way you can support this or any of our shows is by visiting our show page in iTunes and giving us a nice review to help other Trek fans find us. And if you can't find the show by searching iTunes, you can find a direct link to our iTunes reviews on the How to Listen page at trekprofiles.com. Speaking of iTunes reviews, @TrekkieRob asked on the Twitter how to give a review if he's an Android user. Well, we love all types here on the Trek Profiles podcast, including our beloved Android users. So you have a few options. First, of course, if you happen to have iTunes installed on a PC for some reason, you can always use that to leave a review as well, so you don't need a mobile device. However, we would also appreciate your reviews on any other podcast platform that you may use, such as Stitcher or Google Play. And along those lines, I'd like to give a shout out to listeners Patrick and Carl for leaving us some wonderful reviews on iTunes. Your support of the show really counts in making the show visible to other Trek fans and help them find us. Okay, let's see what you fine people thought of the Kobayashi Maru questions from Episode 3 with Amy Nelson. I tweet out the questions as a Twitter poll after each episode drops, so all of you can have your say. Let's see what we got. Question 1. Who was a better match for Picard, Vash, the criminal archaeologist, or Aneej from Star Trek Insurrection? Amy Nelson was firmly and completely in the Aneej camp, but it turns out that most of you seem to prefer Picard matched with a bad girl, and Vash won by 54 to 46%, and if I listen closely, I can hear Amy gnashing her teeth right about now. Question 2. Q in TNG. Not enough, too much, or just right? Amy said not enough, but most of you said just the right amount. That was the top vote getter at 69%, with 22% saying not enough and 9% saying too much. Question 2. Q in TNG. Not enough, too much, or just right? Amy said not enough, but most of you said just the right amount, and that was the top vote getter at 69%, with 22% saying not enough and 9% saying too much. Number 3. Who was a better doctor for the crew? Dr. Crusher or Dr. Pulaski? Amy really struggled with this one, eventually settling for Pulaski, but in the Twitter poll, Crusher crushed it with 74% to 26%. Question 4. Time for some recreation. Will it be some 3D chess or an energetic game of Parisi squares? Just like Amy Nelson, all of you selected 3D chess. The total was 73 to 27%. There seemed to be some concern about the physicality and the rules in Parisi squares, so y'all were playing it safe on that one, and I can't say I blame you. Question 5. Worst Star Trek snack idea. Guardian of Forever donut holes that make you relive minor but annoying events from your past, or Hasbrat flavored cheesecake that makes your eyes water and your skin crinkle up like a Bajoran nose? Well, there was a vigorous Twitter discussion on this one. The issue seemed to revolve around if Hasbrat was spicy like spicy chicken wings or spicy sour like salt and vinegar tater chips. My personal opinion is that we really don't have enough primary source material to determine if it's the salty, vinegary stuff or if it's the spicy stuff. But since Hasbrat's supposed to be made from a brine, I thought it was salty. Anyway, it seems we had Hasbrat as the worst snack idea by 69 to 31%. Keep an eye on my Twitter if you'd like to have your say on this week's Kobayashi Maru questions. That's going to do it for all the messages and feedback, so let's start the show. M5, roll it. Her favorite character is a three-way toss-up between Picard, Jadzia Dax, and Cadet Tilly. Her favorite ship is the Defiant, and she's currently working her way through Voyager. You can find her on Twitter as @DelithiumCrystal. She's from someplace right out of a Class H desert planet, the city of Las Vegas, Nevada, North America, Earth, in Sector 001. It's Crystal Pisano. Welcome, Crystal, and thank you for being on my podcast.
Hello!
I'm so excited you could take the time to be on the podcast.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
Crystal, it's time for question 1. Are you a Star Trek fan?
I am a Star Trek fan. Very much so.
How long have you been a Star Trek fan?
As long as I can remember. Definitely since childhood. Probably around the age of 7 or 8 if I had to guess, but honestly I don't remember a time when I wasn't a Star Trek fan, so.
Do you remember your first series?
Next Generation is definitely my first series, and that's the one that kind of was really my only series for a lot of my young life.
Is it still your favorite?
It is not my favorite anymore, and that actually just changed about a year and a half ago. So it had been my favorite for most of my life, but the reason it was my favorite is because I had never watched all of Deep Space Nine, and having finally done that, Deep Space Nine became my favorite, and then Discovery came out, and it's really hard to say that a single season of a show can be my favorite, but I'd say Discovery's on trajectory to overtake DS9 as well at this point, but it's hard to say that a single season can beat the depth and breadth of DS9 in its entirety, so we'll say that it's on its way up, but DS9 is at the top for now.
We'll call it a promising challenger.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, if they continue on the trajectory that they're on for me personally, it will be my favorite. I just don't want to say that after a single season.
Okay, so it's too early to commit, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of commitment for only one season of a show.
Have you seen all 700 and something hours of Star Trek, all the series and movies and so forth?
No, in fact, I probably have seen a lot less than most people would assume. Like, if an average person knew that I was a Star Trek fan, I would think they would assume I've seen most of it. And really, that's not the case. I've seen all of Next Generation. I've seen all of DS9. I've seen bits and pieces of the original series. I've seen now almost 2 seasons fully of Voyager in my watch of it, and I've seen other episodes of Voyager here and there back when it originally aired, but I don't know how much. I've never seen any of Enterprise. I have seen all of the movies, though, like every single movie. That's the one, I guess, though, other than those two, the series, the Next Generation and DS9. I've seen those in their entirety, and I've seen all the movies. So those are the areas where I'm more well-versed, I should say.
How about the animated series?
I've not seen the animated series, and I hear really good things. I mean, I hear bad things too, but like, it's definitely on my list. I'm gonna eventually try and get through all of the TV series. It's just been tough because after so many years of having not seen a lot of the content, you hear good and bad things, and you kind of, I've got some preconceptions in my head about some of the series that have made it tougher for me to get into. Like Voyager, I had actually put off for quite a while, especially because I had heard about all of the drama that happened on set between Kate Mulgrew and Jerry Ryan. And since I really like strong female characters in Star Trek, I was like, oh man, like when I get to those 7 of 9 episodes, is it going to be weird to watch those knowing what was going on behind the scenes? But I love Kate Mulgrew as an actress, and I do really enjoy Voyager, like the episodes I had seen. So I was like, no, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to watch the whole thing. And I'm almost at the end of season 2, so I haven't hit 7 of 9 yet, but I know she's coming.
Well, there is the fact that they did reconcile at one point. So it seems like it's one big happy family now at that point. So there is that at least.
That definitely makes it better. But it's just, it feels tough because, you know, some of the decisions that the network made at the time, you know, bringing on a younger, so, you know, supposedly hotter female onto the show, like it doesn't quite sit with me right. And so, but you know, there's problematic stuff all across Star Trek and other sci-fi series. So it's a matter of just rectifying that in my head with all of the good stuff that exists there as well.
Sure. I have to tell you, I had a TOS rewatch that I did recently when, actually wasn't so recently, but it was when the Blu-rays came out. And I grew up on TOS. That was the Star Trek that I first saw. I knew those episodes inside, outside, and upside down, and could probably recite lines verbatim from just an episode title. And when I went back and I watched them from the Blu-rays, there was so much that jumped out at me, like the casual sexism, the preconceived notions, and even some of the things that I had pretty well in my head that were true turned out not to be true. Like, as an example, I seem to have always recalled that in TOS Star Trek in particular, that there was no religion in the 23rd century. And yet when I went and did a rewatch, I went back and there's Angela Martine kneeling and saying a prayer in Balance of Terror, something I'd completely forgot about. But when I went back and I rewatched it, it jumped out at me, and it really challenged some of my own preconceived headcanon that I had going on at the time, for sure. So I think it's going to be very interesting for you as you go back and you watch it all, especially going through Voyager with all the things that you know that happened in the show and all the meta information that you have. And also being at, I think, probably a different place in your life than when the show was originally on, you'll certainly have a different reaction to it. So it's going to be interesting to see.
I'm very excited. And what's interesting is I actually haven't had the end of the series spoiled for me, or if I have, I don't remember it, so I don't know what happens to them at the end of Voyager. I don't know if they are still in the Delta Quadrant. I don't know if they get back from the Delta Quadrant. I really honestly have no idea. And if it does get spoiled for me, that's not gonna, I'm not gonna stop the rewatch, but I'm excited to find out what happens.
So let's just put a warning out, a friendly warning, or a piece of advice, I should say, to all the Twitter friends out there. Let's not spoil anything for poor Dilithium Crystal over here. Let's let the show happen naturally for her, and let that element of surprise happen, and let's keep the spoilers away. Maybe the M5 will get cranky if you spoil it, and maybe he'll have something to say. So let's not tempt the M5, because he could be slightly devious. So let's not do that.
I mean, if it happens, it happens. And that's the thing. I'd recognize that at a certain point, the amount of spoilers that you can avoid diminishes with time. But, it's neither here nor there.
Crystal, one of the things I've been talking about on the show with some previous guests, in particular, I'm thinking about the episode I did with Bill Smith from the Trek Geeks. What an amazing guy, by the way. But when he was on the show, one of the things we talked about was how people are consuming Star Trek in different ways nowadays. And so you're doing your Voyager rewatch, and either you have the DVD set or you're watching it on some streaming platform where the whole thing is available commercial free. And yet when you started watching TNG back in the day in syndication, I imagine that you were watching it on some local channel, and an episode was selected for you to watch every day. And either you watched that episode or you chose not to watch Star Trek that day. And you had to watch it with commercial breaks, and then you had to stop and then let it settle in. And then the next day there'd be another episode for you. And that gave time for contemplation. It gave time to think about the episodes. It allowed, I think, the consumer to be a little bit more thoughtful about the episodes, because you had to watch it and you had to let it settle. But now in the era of streaming, we're having a very different experience as we consume these episodes. So I'd be curious for your thoughts on that.
I think it does change the way that you approach it. And I think, honestly, it's changed not just for Trek, but for TV as a whole. And I don't know, it almost, I think, has spoiled us in a way, because while you can watch the episodes of a show in order, obviously you can binge watch a thing, or you can just watch them, one at a time every day or every week or however you want. I think the ability to pick and choose has actually made shows like Star Trek potentially more approachable to people who wouldn't have otherwise watched it. Because I think well, I don't know if I have a specific example for Star Trek, but I have one from another series. So a lot of my friends have said, you know, oh, well, I'm not watching X series. You know, should I? Where should I start? What should I do? And for like Doctor Who, I always tell people, I'm like, okay, if you want to see if you'll like Doctor Who as a whole, go watch the episode Blink, with the very first appearance of the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who, because it's kind of a bubble episode. Like, the Doctor's barely in it. You don't have any overarching plots that connect really to much of the rest of the series or even that season, but it has a very, like, it feels like a Doctor Who episode. And I'm like, if you watch that and you like it, chances are you'll like the rest of Doctor Who. And you wouldn't have been able to do that, you know, 50 years ago. So I think it's really neat that you can kind of make content more approachable, and you can consume it in whatever way fits you best. And that's really neat.
By the way, I just have to say, the Weeping Angels are clearly one of the most terrifying things I think I've seen. I mean, they are just so scary. And what makes them so scary is that there's just not much there. And it really is probably the best example I can think of less is more. And today with special effects, especially, people want to give in to the over-the-top special effects to make things creepy or scary. But those Weeping Angels are just absolutely terrifying. And they're so basic. I think it's just really magical.
Oh, yeah. Just like that episode, it's like, how can a completely frozen statue be that terrifying? And they did such a good job with it. And it's, just so good. And that's, I tell people, I'm like, if you like Blink, you'll like a lot of Doctor Who. And that's not to say every episode of Doctor Who is a winner. Just like, I'm the same in Star Trek. But I know. Yeah, no, I have a friend of mine who is a little more well-versed in Trek than I am. And occasionally while I'm watching episodes, I will message him on Twitter and be like, oh, I just watched this and it was lovely. Or, oh man, that episode, very problematic. So,
Crystal, you talked about the idea that streaming makes it more approachable, and that's certainly true, but there's a counter argument against that. So, for instance, you talked about watching Discovery. And one of the things that we know about how they're choosing to put the show together is that it's so incredibly heavily serialized that you have to watch the thing in order. It's just not the kind of show where you can jump in at episode 7 or episode 12 and really make heads or tails of it. I mean, not if you have any strong interest in it, for sure. So certainly that speaks against that whole concept. What do you think? That's
true. And I'll admit I like the overarching storylines more than the episodic stuff. I always have enjoyed the things that can make connections. But Star Trek as a whole is so big that I think some people need a jumping off point. So it's kind of nice that the older shows are episodic, because then you can kind of jump in wherever. But yeah, with Discovery, aside from a couple of episodes like Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad, or even the one that I don't like, which now I can't remember, CV Pacem Parabellum, the one that's on the planet with the...
Oh, the Pavans?
Yes, which is one of my... Actually, it's my least favorite episode of the whole season. But I think, like, you could probably watch those and still... Like, those would be okay standalone. But yeah, for the most part, most of Discovery, you need the context of the rest of the episodes to really, truly enjoy it, I think. So, I don't know. I've been telling everybody I know to watch it. I'm like, I will give you my CBS login. Please watch Discovery, because if this show doesn't continue, I will be real sad. And at least we're getting season 2, so I'm happy about that.
You know, I really enjoyed the first season of Discovery. I really enjoyed it a great deal. But one of the things that I am acutely aware of and slightly pained by, if maybe that's the right word, I'm not sure, is that Star Trek at its best, and it's historically known for telling these little morality plays in this 42 to 50 minute package, you know, based on the running time of whatever the show happened to be at that given time. And I think that because of the heavily serialized nature of Discovery, perhaps we're missing that little self-contained morality play format. Even Deep Space Nine, which was pretty heavily serialized, was still pretty good at telling those little self-contained morality plays. They really did strike a balance, I think, between those two extremes. And I don't know how Discovery is doing in that regard. I think that that's still an open question. And I just want to acknowledge that I understand there was a lot of turmoil in the writer's room and a lot of changes before the show went on the air. So we know that with Discovery, there was just a lot of issues that they were dealing with, and they were really trying to lay the railroad tracks in front of a train that was coming up right behind them. So especially in season 1, they may not have had the ability to tell the kind of stories they wanted to tell. Having said that, I'm thoroughly on board the train and am signed up for season 2 and can't wait for it. And I'm sure I'm going to enjoy it thoroughly. And I'm eager to see what they're able to do now that they've had a little breather and a little bit of time to reorganize.
I would agree that you can kind of see where like there are chinks in the armor, so to speak. And that definitely has to do, I would imagine, with Brian Fuller's departure from the show and Aaron Harberts and Gretchen Berg taking over as the showrunners. But like, Brian Fuller's handprints are all over the show, even in its final iteration. And people are like, oh, Brian Fuller only wrote, a couple of the episodes. But no, like you can see in the story for the whole season that his imprints are there. Like specifically the Stamets' character and his arc as a character. I don't have any proof to this, I guess, but everything involving Stamets, I feel Brian Fuller must have kind of fleshed out all on his own. Brian Fuller has this weird obsession with mushrooms and the actual real person, Paul Stamets. And when I say obsession, I don't mean that in an offensive way. I mean that in like a nice, cool excitement obsession. But like, he actually had a character named Stamets in his, somewhat recent show Hannibal as well. So like that is obviously all Fuller, but and Stamets' arc is key to much of at least the first half of the season with the spore drive. So when he left, I don't know what state the show was in, but I feel like they did a pretty good job of gluing things together and filling in the gaps where they could. And it's hard to know, who made what decisions, but I think that they're going to, or I have hopes that they're going to dive much more deeply into some of the characters and, as you said, kind of go into some more of those morality play type episodes. I think they've kind of set themselves up in a way to do that really well, particularly with a character like Stamets, having lost his partner, which I know was controversial for a number of reasons, but they've alluded to the fact that relationship or his love for Culber, is still going to be a key component for him going forward. And everyone's, been guessing online as to whether that means, is Culber still in the mycelial network? Will Stamets be able to talk to him? Is the spore that landed on Tilly's shoulder actually Culber, or is it Lorca? There's a whole bunch of things going on in regard to that, but I think that they've set themselves up. They've given us the framework for all of these really interesting and dynamic characters that they didn't quite get to explore as much as they would like, and I hope that they do more of that in season 2.
So let's talk very briefly about how you're consuming Discovery. When you watch it, are you watching it in a solitary way, or are you watching it with other people?
I typically watch it alone. My husband has been watching as well, although he happened to often be busy when the episodes went live, so I would usually watch it the first time by myself. Sometimes on certain shows I'll wait for my husband to become available so we can watch them together, but I think he understands that my love of Trek runs pretty deep, and I'm not going to wait for something like that. But then I'll watch it a second time when he watches it for the first time. But yeah, generally I'm watching most Star Trek stuff alone, at least at this point in my life.
Do you have any thoughts on how it changes your perception of the episode if you're watching it with a group of people, or if you're watching it solo, or if you're watching it with your husband, or how do you feel about that?
I don't think it really does. I tend to have pretty visceral reactions to, especially, big dramatic events and shocking twists and things like that. Like, even if I'm sitting on the edge of my bed alone watching, I'll, still gasp audibly at a crazy moment or whatever else. So I don't think it really changes. But honestly, I haven't watched a lot of Star Trek with other people. I've had friends that were offered, especially with Discovery's first season, there were a couple friends that offered to watch with me or come over, and I kind of like watching alone. I like consuming Star Trek alone, and I'm not 100% sure as to why that is, but yeah.
Do you watch it on a big screen or on the small screen on some kind of personal device? Because one of the things we've been talking about on some of the earlier episodes is that for some people, and I'm not sure if this is universal or not, but when you're consuming it in a solitary way on a smaller screen, I think that the eye is drawn to certain parts of the screen and certain other things that maybe on the big screen you wouldn't notice as much. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I think it does somehow change how we perceive it. I'm not sure. That might be in my own head. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I watch it on the TV in my house, which I guess would be considered pretty large. It's not like nothing gigantic or movie theater sized, but it's a large widescreen TV. And yeah, so you can see the detail, especially regarding the special effects and other things like that. So I think it looks pretty big and epic, and I'm really enjoying watching it that way. If the only way I had to watch it was on a mobile device or something like that, I would definitely do it, because I'm not going to not watch Star Trek if I didn't have the means to watch it on a larger screen, but I'm enjoying watching it on a larger screen.
Crystal, do you have any particular memories of the very first episode you ever saw? Can you recall what it was?
I can't remember the first episode that I saw. I know that it was Next Generation. I know that it was with my dad. My dad was born in 1958, so he grew up with the original series, and he's definitely who introduced me to Star Trek when I was younger. So I watched Next Generation with him. I think I remember fairly distinctly going to see Star Trek Generations in a theater. So that's probably like my first tangible memory of Star Trek. And I'm fairly certain I had seen a number of Next Generation episodes, obviously before 1994, but I don't remember any of them specifically from that time. And it was funny because when I did my Next Generation rewatch here a handful of years ago, I wasn't sure how much of Next Generation that I had seen, because I didn't watch every single episode when they aired live back in the day, because obviously schedules, lack of DVR, that kind of thing made it difficult. And I had seen a vast majority of the episodes, but there were a handful of episodes that were really good that I had never seen before, so it was neat to pick those up when I binge watched the whole thing.
Well, I have to laugh because you bring up something that was an experience that I had just recently, because I've just been doing a TNG rewatch. Well, not just recently, but I finished recently a TNG rewatch. And I remember when TNG first came on the air, and I knew where I was in life. I was in high school at the time, and I was a Star Trek fan since before high school. So and I talked about it with my friends. I was very aware of the show coming on. And I have absolute metaphysical certitude, without a doubt, that at least the first couple seasons, I watched every episode the moment it came on in my local market. It was appointment viewing. I know I watched Encounter at Farpoint. I came in the next day or whenever it was, talked about it with my friends. We talked about every episode as it came on. And there was one of the very earliest episodes in season 1, which was a horrible episode called Code of Honor. And as I'm watching the rewatch, this episode comes on, and I'm watching it, and not a single neuron is firing. And I'm thinking, I have absolutely no recollection of this episode, anything to do with it, the plot, the characters, the action, the story. None of it had any resonance with me whatsoever. And there was no doubt in my mind that I watched the episode when it first came on in its first run, and it was just very weird to me. And when the rewatch came on, I was like, what is this? Oh my goodness.
How funny.
Do you remember that episode, Code of Honor?
Not off the top of my head. Maybe I pushed it out of my memory.
Good for you. That is the right answer.
I mean, I definitely wouldn't have remembered it from its original airing, because, I mean, the series started in 87?
Thereabouts, yep.
So I would have been 2. I turned 3 at the end of 1987, so I definitely wasn't really actively watching Trek at that point. I did watch it during my binge watch here a few years ago, but off the top of my head, it does not ring a bell.
Good. I strongly recommend you keep it that way. Feel no compunction whatsoever to watch that episode. Just skip right over it, and all of TNG will be elevated for you having not watched it. Take my word on that one. It is one of the episodes that I would say one of the very, very few Trek episodes, all series, that has absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And if any of you out there disagree with me, come at me, bro, on the Twitter, at TrekProfiles. So we've talked a little bit about what Star Trek you've seen. We've talked about the fact that you are committed to becoming a completist at some point and watching all of it, which is great. We've talked about Discovery Season 1 and what your thoughts are of that and how you really like it, which is fantastic. So my next question is, how do you express your fandom, Crystal? In particular, let's start with collections. Do you collect anything? Do you collect ships or models or clothes, uniforms, patches, anything like that?
I have, not for the most part. I'm not much of a collector. I do have a handful of items. I've always kind of been a fan of nerdy t-shirts, and I do have a few that are Star Trek themed. I have one that looks like an adoption poster, and it's got little caricatures of Kirk and Spock on it, and it says "Save a Tribble." I've got another one that's a poker table with Picard face palming, Riker yelling, Darth Vader, and then oh my gosh, it's a trap guy from Star Wars. So there's 2 Star Wars.
Admiral Akbar.
Yes, Akbar. There's the 4 of them sitting at a poker table, and Picard's yelling, "I have 4 aces!" And Akbar's yelling, "It's a trap!" And oh my gosh, I can see, well, after the episode goes live, I'll find a link to the image on this shirt, but it's so funny, and it's nice because then it straddles the line between Star Trek and Star Wars. I like to dive into all fandoms a little bit. So yeah, I have some other shirts that are Star Trek in nature. I did get a disco shirt as soon as the Star Trek store had those on sale. As soon as that episode aired where they were running in the disco shirts, I was like, oh, I'm getting one of those. I was going to make it if I had to. And then I have some jewelry that's Star Trek themed, nothing expensive or fancy, but I have a necklace with an insignia. And then my favorite piece of anything that I own that's Star Trek themed, I have a pair of laser cut acrylic batleth earrings, and I get compliments on them everywhere I go, even from people who have no idea what they are. And it's funny because occasionally somebody will be like, "Wow, your earrings are really cool. Are those from Star Trek?" And like, they won't really know what they are, but they'll almost kind of recognize them. So maybe batleths have crossed over into the normal knowledge of an average person, but they look really neat whether you know what they are or not.
Oh, that sounds amazing and wonderful. Are they dangly kind of earrings, or are they just on posts?
Yeah, they're dangly, so they hang from my ears, and they're just like a laser cut acrylic. It's clear acrylic, but then it's kind of got a silver backing on it, so they look metallic when you're looking at them from the front. And yeah, they're really awesome.
Well, I think that's just wonderful, and I strongly recommend that you wear them at the Star Trek convention. I think people will love them, and people will come up to you and ask you where you got them, for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
So speaking about the Star Trek convention, are you planning on attending this year, the one in Las Vegas?
I am, and this will be, I think, actually the first year that I'm going kind of in a more significant fashion. I've been to the convention a few times over the years, but most of the time it's been like, oh, I'll go for a whole day, or I'll go for a special panel or something like that. But I've never really gone to the convention in its entirety for multiple days, and this is going to be the first time that I'm doing that. So I'm pretty excited about it. Even though I've lived in Vegas for 10 years, it's kind of similarly to what Amy said on her episode a couple ago now. You know, she lives in Vegas, but if she went, she would go alone and just kind of do a few things, and that was it. And then once she got into podcasting, she started going more heavily. And I'd say it's kind of the same for me. I'm not podcasting about Star Trek, but I've gotten more active in the online community, and it's made me want to be more participatory in the convention. And honestly, Discovery is a big part of it for me as well. Now that Discovery exists, I'm a little bit more excited to go to the convention. While I do love the older shows and the older casts, I'm reinvigorated by Discovery, and so I want to see as much as I can about that.
Yeah, last year as we record this in the 2017 show, in the 2017 convention, I should say, they had a Discovery Day, and they had that main theater loaded up with a lot of Discovery content, and it was one panel right after the other, right after the other. And in my own recollection, I can't think of a time that I actually spent that much time in the main theater in one stretch. It was really unprecedented for me, because normally I'm just not in the main theater that much anymore. Which I think, by the way, is typical as people who've been to the same Star Trek Las Vegas convention year after year. You go and you see the talent, you go and you see the panels, and it's great. And I know that there's some people who get those gold tickets and they're right up front and they sit there in that main theater and they watch those things. straight through every year, and, bless them for it. But I think that there's a significant number of people like myself that, you've seen a lot of these people, you've seen a lot of them, the same panels and the same topics, you've heard the same questions, you've heard the same stories. And while it's great to see them, you start to explore the other panels. You start to see what's going on in the secondary theater or the CBS/Roddenberry theater. I don't know what they're calling it this year, but that tertiary theater. And you see more interesting things. And it's interesting to branch out and see some of that stuff.
Because, once you get to know the people, it becomes more about hanging out with them, I would imagine, than seeing. Because honestly, as much as you love the casts and everything else, if you've seen a panel with one of the show's casts before, or if many times, you're not usually going to get anything specifically unique out of them in another showing, I would imagine.
You can only see his royal shatness so many times. I mean, he is what he is. He's got a lot of energy and vigor, especially for a man of his age. He puts on a good show, but, you've seen it. But I always recommend people get out and at certain points and go check out what's going on those other stages, because it's certainly pretty interesting stuff, and you can find some more interesting things to talk about and maybe some newer things that you won't see on the main stage. So I encourage people to look very carefully at that schedule and be judicious and sample different things. Think of it like a buffet. And I think that'll be the right model for you.
Well, and especially in the smaller areas, it's a little bit more intimate and it's less, because in that main hall, especially if you aren't sitting close, you're basically just staring at the large screens the whole time. You're not even really getting to look at the people. And it just, I don't know. I like the more intimate panels for sure.
So, Crystal, what do you think you're going to get out of this 2018 STLV that you didn't get out of previous years? Why are you coming back again if you've seen it all?
Well, since I've connected with some people in the Star Trek Las Vegas Facebook group, I'm hoping to get to meet some of them in person and maybe make some friends and hopefully get to know some people like you who live in Las Vegas, who I just haven't happened to have met before. Most of my friends here in town are definitely like nerds like I am, but very few people that I know happen to be Trekkies. And, that's completely fine, but occasionally I want to nerd out with somebody about Star Trek, and I don't really have many people in my life that I can do that with aside from online. So it'll be fun to get to nerd out with people in person for the first time. I
am in strong agreement with the sentiments you're expressing there, because I'll tell you, I've got the most wonderful people around me, and they're just amazing, and I love them all dearly. But they're just not Trek fans, right? So this is my outlet, this podcast, and this is my opportunity to talk to amazing Trek fans and to nerd out a little bit and to have these kinds of conversations, which, hopefully contribute to the fandom in a positive way. And, I really enjoy it. And this is how I get my Trek on, as it were, because I have no other outlet for it in my day-to-day life with the people around me at home and at work and so forth. So that's kind of nice. And I think you'll find that that's one of the main draws of STLV2 is that it's this whole sense of the tribe gathering, and you're around these people that have this passion for this show and the messages of the show. And it's really something special. And I think that the other attendees make it more than the panels ever could. And to go even further, one thing I would encourage you to consider very strongly is, if you've never done it, consider staying at the hotel. Because when you're staying at the hotel, it really does change the dynamic of how you experience the convention. Because I live in Las Vegas too, as you know, and I've shared on the podcast before. And I used to just go for a day and enjoy it, and then I would leave. And once I left at the end of the day, I wasn't going back for sure. But when you are staying there, it just changes the whole dynamic. In my conversation with Amy Nelson, I think we described it as the difference between taking a class at a university and having like the full-on dorm experience. They're just not really the same thing, and it changes it so much. And it's really a positive experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, it's a matter of both time and money. I have 3 dogs at home, and really I don't live super far from the hotel. It's about, assuming traffic on the 15 isn't bad, it's really only about a 15-minute drive for me to get to the Rio from my house. My husband travels a lot, so I don't know specifically if he's traveling that weekend in August, but if he is, then I need to come home, especially because of the dogs and things like that. And money's always an issue. I travel a lot for other things. I go to board game conventions throughout the year. And so it seems silly to pay for a hotel room in the town where I have my own bed. So I'm probably not doing that this year, but maybe at some point in the future.
Hey, I don't blame you for that at all. We all have to make the right choices for us, but I just would encourage you to consider it one year if you can, as an extravagance for yourself, because it really does change the experience. But whichever way it goes, you and I will certainly connect there, and we'll say hello, and I'll certainly owe you an Altair water or a Saurian brandy or whatever as my thank you for being on my podcast. So you can certainly take that to the bank.
That sounds awesome.
Do you cosplay at all?
I have not done any Star Trek cosplay. I do a pretty cool Halloween costume almost every year, and I haven't dove into anything Star Trek related in the past. And I think that's mostly because I tend to cosplay characters that I resemble physically at least a little bit. I've diverted from that a couple of times, but there really haven't been any female characters in Star Trek, at least until Discovery, that I saw myself in a physical way, in a way that I really wanted to embody them. And so it was just something that, and honestly, like, if I guess if you dove deep, I could probably find somebody, but really, if I'm going to cosplay, even if it's a little bit obscure, I want it to be recognizable to most people, and Star Trek tends to be a little more niche than other fandoms, or at least it was in the past. So oh my gosh, it's the end of May as we record this, and I have not really put together anything for STLV yet. A friend of mine has offered to help me. I am desperately wanting to cosplay as Captain Killy at STLV, and I now only have, oh my gosh, if it's the end of May, I have 2 months to put that together, and I know that is not enough time, but I'm hoping that I can still figure it out, because Tilly is basically me. In both personality-wise, a little bit looks-wise, I love her to death, and I want to be Captain Killy so much. So I'm hoping I can pull that off, but no promises, I guess, since it's 2 months away and I don't have it put together.
I'm not sure why I suspect this, but I suspect that there are going to be a ton of Killies running around at STLV and at all the other conventions, the Comic-Cons and whatnot. I suspect it's just going to be very popular. In fact, I suspect it may be even more popular than Tilly.
I mean, it's such a fun character because you get to be basically Tilly as Killy, which is just fun to begin with. Like, everybody's going to be going around, what the heck? What the hell? Like, it's going to be great. And my plan, and I guess if I put this out there, other people can steal it, but honestly, that's fine, is I want to print a rag that's tongue shaped and allow people to quote unquote lick my boots with said rag for photo ops if I do it. So
an excellent and admirable idea.
So if somebody wants to steal that, just, I don't know, at least say some random girl on the internet gave you the idea.
I think it's absolutely perfect. One of the things that just occurred to me as we were talking about this, specifically about Killy, is that we never actually got to see the real Captain Killy in the show. We only saw Tilly's portrayal of her. And I wonder, as we sit here, if we had seen the actual Captain Killy being as bloodthirsty and as kooky as those Mirror Universe people are, I wonder if that would have affected what we thought of the Tilly character. Because there's this whole concept that, you're the same as you are, just a little bit different. You have your darker side is ascendant in the Mirror Universe. And so maybe we would be ascribing a very dark thing, and it might change our perceptions of the Tilly character in some weird way. I'm not sure that's fully formulated, but that's as near as I can make it out. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think if you look back at older Star Trek series, it doesn't matter that the same actor or actress is playing the mirror version of a character. I don't think we usually tend to, or at least for me personally, I should say, my opinions of the main character don't tend to be reflective of their mirror counterpart. In fact, it may actually make people like Sylvia more, because sometimes the mirror versions are really bad, and that almost makes the positive aspects of the prime version of them shine. If it's that different, it's whatever. But honestly, Mary Wiseman is such a talented actress, but I don't want to see her be that mean and cruel because she's just so adorable and lovely. I'm sure she could pull it off and I'm sure she'd be really good at it, but I love the positivity and the smiles and everything else that she brings to Tilly as a character, and so I don't really want to see the real Killy. But who knows, maybe we will, and maybe that'll be awesome.
And maybe you're right, but I certainly think it would change people's perspectives to see an actual Captain Killy who's, murdering people and, just wiping out civilizations and, evaporating continents and stuff like that off of planets. I think that certainly would maybe put some people off the Tilly train. I don't know. Although I will say, I think it'd be great for Mary Wiseman. I think she could totally tear it up and she could do it convincingly and would be awesome at it.
Oh, for sure.
All right, then. Very good. So we've talked about your fandom, your Star Trek origin story, as it were, and how you express your fandom and some of the things like that. So one of the things that I had the M5 do was a little bit of gentle internet sleuthing and a little bit of other research. And it came up with a list of Trek episodes which were either noteworthy to you or meaningful in some way to you. So I want to go through them one at a time. I'm not going to hit you with the whole list. And what I want to do is I want to see if we can figure out why you think this is either one of the best episodes of Trek or why a given episode that we found is particularly meaningful to you. And we can explore that together and sort of dive in and see where we want to go with it. I think we'll start with TNG. And the first one I think we'll dive into is Best of Both Worlds. And the first question is, should we talk about one particular half of the two-parter, or for the purposes of this discussion, should we look at both of them together as one episode?
I would say for the purposes of this discussion, we could probably take them as a single unit.
Then why, in your opinion, is Best of Both Worlds one of the best episodes of Star Trek?
So Best of Both Worlds, I think, is kind of where Next Generation really came into its own. And that's not to say that there wasn't good or even amazing episodes prior to this, but this, we had already talked about, now we can stream things or binge watch stuff. But when the first half of Best of Both Worlds aired at the end of season 3, that's a crazy huge cliffhanger to leave a show on. And it's hard for me to remember what that was like, because a lot of modern shows I've watched after the fact or picked up a little bit later in their tenure after they've been on for 2 or 3 seasons. And so I've had less moments of having to wait for a thing in my adult life. And I don't remember it from when I was a kid. I imagine my dad and I probably watched it together, but maybe not. Honestly, it aired back in 1990, so I would have been 5, almost 6. So, and this feels pretty scary for a kid of that age. So maybe I didn't even get to see it when it originally aired. But it's powerful because I think it subverts a lot of expectations about what a TV show would be willing to do to its main character. And it really put the viewers in a position where they weren't sure what was going to happen. And that honestly, in a lot of TV shows, doesn't happen that often. In almost every single show, for the most part, you always know exactly how it's going to end. And even if you aren't quite sure how they're going to get there, with Best of Both Worlds, I don't think anybody was quite sure, at least from what I've heard anecdotally after the fact. Is when Riker says fire at the end of the episode and that's it, wait, what? How do you even, I can't imagine what that was like to watch live and then have to wait for the next episode. That seems crazy to me. And of course, Jean-Luc Picard getting assimilated is just nuts. Patrick Stewart is a brilliant actor, and it's funny because when he's a Borg, I think he's fine as a Borg, but it stifles him as an actor, but it makes the story more interesting. So I love it. I think it's good. I actually got to see Best of Both Worlds on the big screen a few years ago when they were doing events with Fathom, where theaters are showing stuff. And so when they re-released this season on Blu-ray, they showed both Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2 on the big screen. And so I got to see them in HD on a giant screen, and that was so cool.
Oh, that's completely cool. I took my kid to see Star Trek II at one of those Fathom events things, and there really is something about just sitting in the movie theater and just seeing it on the big screen. It just makes it so much more powerful and way more awesome.
Oh, nice. Yeah, they did a bunch. They did an event for season 1, an event for season 2, and then an event for season 3 when the Blu-rays for those seasons came out. And I don't think they did any past that, but I went to all of those. And it was neat because for seasons 1 and 2, they just picked a handful or like 2 or 3 episodes that they screened. And it was really neat. And they also did some behind the scenes stuff about the restoration of the show because they had to recut the show and add back in the special effects, essentially. So they had to kind of redo the original editing work to make it into the Blu-ray content. And I guess I've heard that's why they're likely not going to do it with DS9 or Voyager, because the amount of work that went into that was pretty extensive, and there isn't a huge demand for that content in HD. I mean, from me personally, there is. I would love to have DS9 streaming in HD, but, you know, I'm only one person, so.
Oh, yeah, I would love to see that too. I don't think we'll ever get to see it because of the realities of just how the finances work. I think they have to sell those box sets through retail outlets to make the numbers work. It's just something that if they do it and then release it via streaming, just the revenue isn't there. And I think that that's what the main issue is. But I would certainly love to see it. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Whenever I think about Best of Both Worlds, one of the characters that always comes to the top of my mind isn't actually Locutus, although he's fantastic, but I always think about the Shelby character played by Elizabeth Dennehy. Certainly an interesting kind of character. What do you think about her?
Honestly, I don't really have a lot of thoughts about her. She's not a favorite of mine as far as female characters go in Star Trek, but I don't know. It's weird. I hate when I don't enjoy how a female character is presented. As a woman, you know, I kind of want to be like, yeah, strong female characters, that's awesome. But she came off a little bit arrogant and annoying to me personally. And so it's kind of, and I don't know if that's because there's tension between her and the other main characters that I already knew and loved. So maybe I'm kind of reflecting off of their feelings or something like that, but I don't know. I don't like her very much. What do you like her? Am I crazy?
When it comes to Shelby, I am conflicted. I mean, I enjoy the fact that here's this character who comes in and she is super decisive, and she comes in and she says, here's all the things, A, B, C, D, and we got to proceed in this order and do these things in this way, and we are going to be victorious if we follow this plan. And, you know, you got to admire that we got someone that certainly has a way of being and has that level of decisiveness. And that's not something that we necessarily see all the time. I thought it was just great. But on the other side of it, she really had the dial set at 11, you know, and I think that it's one thing to know the right way to go and to have a specific plan in mind. But you also have to win the captain over and win over the other people to your side. And if you're going to just go in there and use your authority like a club, to quote another science fiction franchise, you're never going to be successful. So I'm kind of conflicted about Shelby. I don't know. How about you?
Yeah, and that's part of, I mean, honestly, even in my mind, and I think in everybody's, we've kind of been programmed is probably not the right word, but like conditioned to be off-put by very strong women. And me as a woman, I recognize that that's a thing. Like, you know, it's when a man asserts himself, he's confident. When a woman asserts herself, she's a B word. And that whole mindset, which is troublesome. And, you know, so maybe I should rewatch and reevaluate and really look at her with a different lens, because I feel like there's probably a lot of female characters, and whether they were written poorly or not, you know, perhaps I haven't approached them in the right way. So.
Ah, interesting. So you think you might be falling into your own sort of judgment trap there with Shelby? Possibly.
Yeah, I think, you know, we all occasionally do that. There's, especially when it comes to things like stereotypes and other stuff, which Trek does fall into pretty frequently, especially the older series. So I think it's hard sometimes to escape that, especially if the characters were written in a specific way. But honestly, a lot of the people who have been on Star Trek were such good actors that I think that there's probably more there than I am remembering, or maybe more to appreciate than I was aware of when I first watched the show or when I rewatched it, a number of years ago.
Crystal, tell me about Deep Space Nine: Change of Heart. For all you listeners out there, this is the one where Worf and Dax go on a mission, and Worf has to decide whether or not he's going to save Dax or complete the mission.
So Change of Heart, I think, is a really neat episode. I will admit I am a sucker for a good love story, and Jadzia's Dax is one of my favorite characters, and Worf is actually one of my favorites as well. And it was interesting because I was a Next Generation fan growing up, and I knew that Worf had crossed over and was in Deep Space Nine, but when Deep Space Nine originally aired, I didn't see much of it. And so I had never really seen Worf outside of Next Generation. And I was like, oh man, like is he going to be as good with the cast with Deep Space Nine? Is it going to be the same cool Worf that I'm used to? And then when he and Jadzia kind of started flirting on the show, I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, but that kind of, it works. And the more that they were together, the more I kind of fell in love with them as a couple. And Change of Heart is really the first episode that you get to see after they've gotten married and, what them as a couple is like. And it really puts Worf in a difficult decision because he basically has to choose between his responsibilities as an officer and Jadzia. And that's troublesome for him. He's always been about duty and honor. He's a Klingon, it's built in, but he loves Jadzia so deeply that he goes back for her. And I think it's a really beautiful moment. I think the plot that surrounds it, they're trying to meet a Cardassian double agent and all of this stuff is a little bit, it's not actually that interesting, but I think the decisions that they're forced to make during that mission are really cool.
How do you feel about the idea that the episode's premise, the very nature of it, makes Sisko look like an idiotic commander because he's sending a married couple on this incredibly dangerous mission? And I think it had to have been obvious to anyone at any time in any universe that would have been a bad idea.
Absolutely. I think it obviously works in the context of a TV show because it helps move the plot along in ways that they want to. But yeah, if we were looking at this in a bubble, like if this were a real space station sending people on a mission, that's ridiculous. It's so silly because you know that no matter how dedicated a person is, if they are put into a situation where they have to choose between, their job and the person they love, that's a really hard thing to force onto somebody, and B, they're, I would imagine, most of the time going to choose the person they love. So Sisko's essentially sabotaging the mission by putting them together on it.
I'm going on memory here, but if I have it right, it was already decided as they were filming this particular episode that Terry Farrell was already going to be off the show. That was already a done deal. And the question was, what was the best way to make her exit from the show? As I watched the episode in preparation for this, the one thing that was on my mind was, I think it would have taken this episode to a whole nother level if Worf had gone back and she had died of her injuries. I think it would have just brought the thing to a whole nother level, but they chose not to do that for some reason. What do you think?
Oh, okay. So, and I didn't know when that decision got made. So that's interesting.
Like, wouldn't it have been even worse? And by worse, I mean better. I don't know. I kind of don't have the right language here, but wouldn't it have been an even more powerful episode full of pathos and I think interesting things for Worf to deal with if he had still made the same decisions that he made and it just didn't work out and she had passed from her injuries when he went back to her? I think it could have brought that episode to a whole nother level. And this is when I get into trouble with Star Trek because I start to think about all this meta stuff like, well, why did the writers choose to do this instead of do that? And why did they make this decision instead of that decision? Or why did they produce it in this way? And, that's my own particular problem. And it's a challenge I deal with all the time. And listeners to this podcast, if they've been paying any attention, they figured out that I often get sucked into those kind of rabbit holes. But it's certainly something I thought about.
Right. No, I know what you mean. That's really interesting. I think it would have been, a better death for her than what she ended up with. Similarly to how I haven't had Voyager spoiled for myself at this point, before I watched all of DS9, I had not had that stuff spoiled for me either. And I did not know that Jadzia was going to die. And when she did die, I was wrecked, like fully like sobbing. I was so upset, and I was messaging my friend online. I was like, as it was happening, I was like, wait, I was like, Jadzia's not gonna die, right? Like, no, Jadzia can't die. They can't kill Jadzia, because I hadn't heard any of the stuff that had gone on with Terry Farrell and all of that before I watched all of it. And I know that there was a lot of like behind the scenes drama involving that. Obviously, I researched all of it after the fact, because I was like, why did they kill Jadzia? How could they do this to me? I took it as a personal slight. But obviously, you know, yeah, when a show loses an actor or an actress, they have to make decisions. And I think you make a good point that there would have been potentially an opportunity to kill her in a more meaningful way by doing it in this episode.
Well, you know, Crystal, whenever I think about Worf, one of the ways I sort of describe him in my head is that he's this character that's decided he wants to be even more Klingon than the Klingons. He has this idea in his head of like the perfect Klingon, like Kahless. He's got Kahless in his head, and like anything short of being Kahless is a failure in Worf's psychology. But yet in TNG and in Deep Space Nine, whenever we see other Klingons, they don't hold themselves to the standard that he holds himself to. We have the Duras, who are, you know, these dishonorable people. We have Kempek, who's sort of this crafty politician guy who's, you know, drinking the poison, if you remember him, but he's like very crafty and political. You know, he just doesn't seem like the sort of bold Klingon type that you expect. And we see Klingons who are full of joy, which Worf could rarely, if ever, be accused of that. So he's set himself up for this very high bar that it seems to me that none of the other Klingons are even remotely interested in. But he has this idea in his head of like Klingon perfection, and he's hell-bent on trying to get there, even when the other Klingons are like, dude, I don't even know what you're talking about. And maybe it's because he was raised on Earth, and so he has this idea in his head, and because when he was growing up, he didn't have any other Klingons to compare himself to. It might be because of that, but I think by the time DS9 comes around, he should certainly know better at this point. Anyway, one of the things about this episode that I found very endearing is that it's one of the few times where he steps back from the precipice of Klingon perfection, and he chooses to go a different way and to explore a different side of himself, as opposed to trying to live up to this ideal standard. And I found that very refreshing for once, that he just wasn't so hell-bent on achieving his mission and glory and Qapla' and all that stuff. So it was just a nice decision to see him choose differently.
Yeah, I think I would imagine that the writers potentially struggled with, like, how do you approach a character that is struggling with his own identity? You know, being raised by humans and interacting with humans, does he adhere to those Klingon ideals so strongly because he fears losing his own personal identity or his heritage? You know, I think that there was that might be part of the reason. Like, how do we ensure that we have a good, strong alien presence? You know, obviously the Enterprise and the Federation as a whole shouldn't be just about humans, although admittedly it's very human in a lot of the series, probably mistakenly so, but special effects weren't so good back in the day. It's easier to have humans than other random aliens. But yeah, like, Worf was someone that I think people were able to relate to in a way that he's played by an African American actor, and he's surrounded by people that are different than him, and he really, really wants to be who he is at his core, and he wants other people to know, no, this is who I am. And so maybe that influences some of the decisions he makes.
Yeah. I remember the TNG episode, whichever one it is, where his human parents come on board the Enterprise, and his mother tells everyone, yeah, he was like 12 years old or whatever age it was. And he said, nope, I will only eat Klingon food. Yeah. So he's on the path of being full Klingon, even when the other Klingons are like, yeah, no, I'm not doing full Klingon. And that's the Klingons are making that decision. But the Klingon that's raised on Earth, he's trying to be even more Klingon than them. And it's very weird.
Right. You know, they're like, oh, we'll eat food from other places occasionally. Why not? I mean, I like a good bowl of gach, but let's have something else occasionally.
And by the way here, I just got to say one thing. I've been doing a Deep Space Nine rewatch recently, and I was actually posting on Twitter about this. Love Klingon Chef on Deep Space Nine. Klingon Chef is awesome. That dude just killed it. Totally loved it.
DS9 has a lot of really great ancillary characters. Like, the main cast is spectacular, but really, a lot of the smaller roles that are recurring in that show are some brilliantly acted roles and really interestingly written characters. It's just great.
So the next episode that the M5 has selected for us to talk about is Darmok. So tell me about that one.
So Darmok is meaningful to me for a couple of reasons. Picard is one of my favorite characters and one of my favorite captains, and I think that Patrick Stewart is really given an opportunity to shine in this episode. Of course, he's really good in a lot of episodes. His acting skills, I mean, everybody knows what Patrick Stewart's background was like before Star Trek, but he leans into the role of Picard in so many ways, and he had an opportunity in this episode to really, not just in the way he spoke, but in his mannerisms and the way he acted, to really like get a nuanced performance out. And this episode in particular, I think is meaningful because I have an interest in etymology, and that's not entomology for those of you who think I'm talking about bugs. It's etymology, and it's the history of words, and it's the study of language. And so having an opportunity for the Enterprise to, and for Picard specifically, to not be able to understand someone when typically they're in situations where the universal translator does all the work for them, I think is really interesting. And especially the way he susses out how to communicate with someone he doesn't know how to communicate with is done really well. I can't speak to how accurate the etymology of the language is, and I believe there have been articles written that it's not actually, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you put it under a microscope, but I think that the idea of it is really, really brilliant. And it's just neat to watch him go from zero understanding to a decent amount of understanding. And I think it probably resonated with a lot of Star Trek fans. I mean, you see, if you say Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, if you like Shaka when the walls fell, people in Star Trek immediately are, you get a smile on your face because it's such a neat thing. And it's a way for Star Trek fans to communicate with one another, which is kind of ironic, but also neat.
Kiteo, his eyes closed. You'll have to say more about that.
I've looked up the different phrases that they use in the episode to try and remember some of the more obscure ones, and I always inevitably end up forgetting them.
So there's this conceit at the center of the show, Star Trek more broadly, that we go into space, we meet these alien races, and while they may have different civilizations, they might have different ideas, they may have different ways of being and different ways of communicating, there's this profound sameness, though, at the center of many of these alien groups, that they still want to communicate with other races, with other aliens. They want to learn about us and they want us to learn about them. They want to have trade or cultural exchange or, whatever it happens to be. But no matter how different they are, they still, for the most part, want that to certainly a far lesser degree. In fact, the extreme opposite degree with the Dominion and DS9, but I think that's the exception rather than the rule. But that's a conceit that's at the center of a lot of them, even when they're like these super powerful races that are like, no, you cannot talk to us. You need to come back in 1 billion years when you've evolved, and then you can speak with us. It's still that conceit is there. They're just saying not now, but at some point in the future. And I think that that's an interesting idea because there are certainly several science fiction episodes, movies, books, and things that I can think of where we meet aliens and they are not like that at all. They have no conception of what it is that we want, and they can't conceive of why we want the things that we want.
Right. Where all the aliens have completely different ideals and completely are often malicious. And in Star Trek, there's definitely, malevolent characters, but it's neat for them to encounter someone that has like ideals, but maybe there's a different problem that's getting in the way.
There was a George Clooney sci-fi movie years ago called Solaris. Did you ever get a chance to see it?
I did not.
Good call. I don't recommend it at all. The reason I say that is because this particular story was very powerful for me. Because what it's about is that it's sort of a modern science fiction film, right? So we discover this planet, and the planet has this alien intelligence on it that we can't really communicate with. So we send these scientists out there to study it. And as these scientists are out there studying this ocean planet that has this intelligence in it somehow, the planet starts sending replicas of people from each scientist's past to them. So like Crystal, if you were there, you would meet someone from your past. But the key thing is that they would be replicated for you not as the person actually was, but they're taken from your memory of that person. So if you were talking to your replica and you were trying to relate to them, what you would discover is that they don't respond in the way that that person actually would, but they respond as you recollect they would. And every single scientist has an incredibly negative reaction to this. The replicas are not a positive experience for anyone. It's terrifying and scary and very awful and traumatic for these people. And the whole concept of it is that it's about a meditation on human memory, that human memory is faulty, and that the profound truth is that you can never really know another person. And they use the science fiction story to tell it.
Oh, wow.
The other part of it, which I think is more relevant here, though, is that trying to figure out what the Solaris planet wants is a human concept. There's no common frame of reference to even understand like why the planet is doing this, what these replicas are supposed to do, what it wants, what it's thinking, what its goals and ideals and ambitions are. It's foreign. It's alien. And that's what being alien is in the science fiction context. And that's very different from what we've seen in Star Trek. So I just thought it was a very interesting comparison as I was watching Darmok, to think that if you go down several layers, there's this commonality, but I could easily see in some science fiction worlds that there could be a completely different interpretation, which, you know, it's pretty wild stuff. Anyway, I thought it was pretty cool. What do you think?
I think that's really neat. And I think that science fiction has kind of done a good job of progressing to tell more interesting stories like that. And I'd say a potentially more modern example, I loved the 2016 movie Arrival. This is, I guess, relevant because it's also about etymology and language, just like Darmok is. But it's about, you know, these aliens who their purpose is 100% unclear and they can't communicate with us, and figuring out how to communicate with them. This movie, I watched it and I was just instantly enamored with it. And it's not only because of the performances of the people in it. Amy Adams is absolutely brilliant in it, but I really love that the movies where the conflict isn't based around hatred, where the conflict is based around confusion. And I think that is probably if we were ever to encounter another species somewhere out there in the universe, I would like to think that might be what would happen. I think a lot of older sci-fi is, all about ray guns and fighting. And I think that it's more interesting to dive into the mental aspects of what it would actually be like to encounter an alien race.
Oh, I completely agree with you that movie was completely amazing and it was absolutely stellar. And I'd also give a complete plug to the book of short stories that it's actually based on. It's called Stories of Your Life by Ted Chiang. And each one of them is absolutely ethereal and complementary to the movie. And every one of the stories is just a real treasure. And I would strongly recommend it. The stories are so different from each other, so beautiful. So there's my unsolicited recommendation.
I'm ashamed to say I haven't picked that up, and I loved that movie so much I can't believe I didn't do that, but now I'm definitely going to.
Yeah, and it's just a short story. It's not even a full-on novel, but yeah, they're all so good and so wildly different. So totally worth it.
Perfect.
Anyways, we digress. So another episode that the M5 has selected, which was identified as being meaningful for you, was Under a Paper Moon, Deep Space Nine. And this is the one where Nog comes back to the space station after losing his leg and decides to spend an extraordinary amount of time in the holodeck with Vic Fontaine. So tell me why this episode was particularly meaningful for you. Why did the M5 select it?
Well, first off, I have to say both Nog and Vic Fontaine were delightful characters to meet and get to know in DS9 for me. I think having been a next generation girl growing up, I was used to the main characters being the main characters and the one-offs only coming in occasionally. And DS9 really fleshed out some of the characters that weren't on the, in the main cast pretty well. And this is a great example of that. So just shout out to both Nog and Vic Fontaine, who I love 100%. I think this one is especially meaningful to me because it kind of mirrors what I think a lot of people, and especially myself, have gone through in life when things have gotten tough. I think many people deal with anxiety or depression, and I definitely have struggled with anxiety, especially as an adult. And there are times when you really just want to disconnect and, kind of throw away the real world and run away from everything. It's that whole paradox where you're so busy and you need to do so many things that you just shut down and do nothing instead. And we've all, I think, experienced that to some degree, some people worse than others. And Nog is struggling with a really heavy thing in the fact that he's lost his leg and he's doubting, who he is and his abilities as a person. And using the holosuite as an escape is a really interesting way of addressing that. And I like holosuite episodes because I think they give the writers a little more flexibility, especially on a show like DS9, where a lot of the action happens in a single location. It kind of gives them the opportunity to go to more interesting places. And honestly, just seeing Nog work through his feelings in that episode and seeing how Vic helps him do that is really cool. And I think it's a testament to how, even though it's really tough to work through issues like that, sometimes you have to reach out and you have to ask for help. Even if it's from your friendly holosuite lounge singer, you need other people to be there. And I think that it's a good message for, luckily I have not struggled with depression to the degree that I've ever wanted to harm myself in any significant way, but I know there's a lot of people that have, and I think it's important to note that, for people who are struggling, you do have to ask for help, and it's really hard to ask for help sometimes, but it's important to do it because your life is worth living, and even when you feel like you can't do anything, or you used to be able to do something and now you can't do that thing anymore, that doesn't mean that you don't have value. It's that you have value in other ways, and sometimes it's hard to see what those other ways are. So I love it. I think it's a really heartfelt episode with a few silly moments in it, obviously, but I think it's great. And the performances of the actors in that episode are also really spectacular.
I agree with you. The performances are wonderful. As I watched the episode, I had a slightly different reaction to it because I'm a veteran and I have a different perspective on some things. And, in my own life, when I tell people I'm a veteran, just because it comes up in conversation or I actually have a veteran's license plate on my car, people will say things like, "Oh, thank you for your service," and like with this very heartfelt way. And it's just eye rolling to me. For me, I appreciate that it's coming from a good place, but it's just something that makes me wince every time I hear it. The other thing that sometimes people immediately ask, which I find unbelievable, is they'll say, "Oh, do you have PTSD?" And I'll say, "What?"
That's such a personal question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
But I can think of 3 times, at least in the last year, where people have asked me that, which I find weird and kooky. But what I thought is interesting is in Deep Space Nine and in all science fiction, you get to take away sort of all the current, I'm going to use a vocabulary word here, milieu of 21st century Earth, and you put it in the science fiction world, and you're able to examine the humanity of something at a really close, intimate level without getting any interference from our modern sensibilities with whatever we think about the current world or the current political parties or whether we should be involved in this particular political thing and this particular foreign adventure or any of that stuff. And I just thought it was a really nice way to examine the psychology of what Nog is going through. And I think it's a pretty powerful episode. This
may be a very dumb question, but I would really like to know. So with your experience as a veteran, when someone learns that, is there something that you wish they would say to you instead? Because obviously, thank you for your service is so kind of generic. And I feel like even if, yeah, like I think for a lot of people, especially in America, it's difficult because we like, well, I guess I'm speaking for myself. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I do appreciate very much the people that have sacrificed their time and potentially their lives to protect the freedoms that I, appreciate every day. And I personally don't always know how to show that appreciation. I was never eligible to enlist because of health related issues. So I never even had that opportunity. I don't know if I would have taken it were it given to me, but I would like to be able to convey that appreciation to people I meet in my life. And I guess maybe I'm not always sure of how to do that. So if you have any advice, I'll take it.
Right. I would just say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself here, and I recognize that when people say thank you for your service, it comes from a good place and they have good intentions behind it. And I don't presume to speak on behalf of all veterans or even anyone besides myself, although I will say that all the veterans that I personally know, I don't know anybody who's, eating up, thank you for your service. I don't actually know anybody that does that, or at least they've never expressed it to me. Most veterans that I know, roll their eyes at it just like I do. So just with that having been said, I think the best thing is just to say, oh, that's wonderful. What branch did you serve in, and what was your role? And just to have a normal conversation. And I think it's the ritualistic aspect of it that I find off-putting. That it's just this thing that people say, and it's just just don't do that. And I find it just weird. So just have a where did you go? Oh, I was in the Navy. What did you do? I was in the submarine service. I worked in the engine room on a submarine in the reactor plant. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, it was. Thank you. And that's it. I mean, just don't make it into too much of a thing, I guess, and avoid the ritual of it is the best thing I could say. And again, that's just speaking for myself. I know that there's other people out there that probably have different perspective around it.
Well, I mean, but to toot your horn for a minute, the people who have made that commitment, it's a big deal. And I think that a lot of people do recognize how big of a deal that is. And obviously, maybe you and others don't want to be theoretically lifted up on a pedestal or anything like that for what you do, but it's important. And so I'm sure that probably the people that are saying that, yeah, definitely well-intentioned and, but yeah, so I was curious. It's
okay. We let it all hang out here on the Trek Profiles podcast because that's how we roll up in here, yo. So anyway, another episode, and this is certainly a fan favorite that the M5 has identified here, which is Inner Light. This episode is interesting in a lot of ways because I think what's interesting about it is that it's an episode that's all in Picard's head, which is really fascinating. So tell me why it's meaningful to you.
Well, I mentioned earlier that I love Picard and I'm a sucker for a love story. So those two aspects are definitely at play again here in Inner Light. And I think honestly for me, throughout the entire duration of Next Generation, both in the TV show and the movies, that it wasn't always overtly talked about, but it was almost always present. Picard was definitely lonely, and he had potential regrets as to what he had done in his life. And I don't think regrets in that, like, he wished he had done something else, but he kind of wondered what would have been had he made other decisions. And I think the ability to have a family is something that weighed heavily on him. And they touch at that, in numerous episodes and the movies. And so things like Star Trek Generations, when he's in the Nexus, and the Inner Light, where he's living out an entire lifetime as Kamen, kind of give you those little glimpses into what he could have had. And it almost makes his character even more sad for me, because he does seem so genuinely happy when he has a family. And I know that he, loves and cares about his friends and the crew of the Enterprise. And he definitely isn't miserable in his normal life, but just getting to see him have a wife and kids and grandkids, and getting to see those pieces of him that that he, at least a part of him, has longed for so long, is honestly just beautiful. And it's another example of Patrick Stewart's like stellar acting skills. He's so good. And I played the flute when I was younger, so we'll give a shout out to the fact that he plays the flute.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Resican flute right there.
Yeah, gotta love the flute. So, but yeah.
I think the best moment of him actually emoting that for us is in, I think it was Generations, when he finds out that Robert has been killed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right at the beginning of Generations when they're on the actual, like, boat in the holodeck, I believe. And he gets the transmission and finds out, that his nephew's been killed. And then later, when he's in the Nexus, he gets to see him again. And, like, that's... Yeah, it's not even his son, it's his nephew, but you get to see how absolutely devastated he is by his nephew being killed, and then getting to see him again later, and how much he longs to have those connections with people. But he's torn because he really does believe in what he's doing for the Federation and for humanity as a whole, but he's missing something. And so I think when we get to fill in those gaps, at least in small ways, it really helps us understand his character better, and it gives him more depth in a way that's really, really compelling.
So I'm looking at the technical readout that the M5 has prepared of episodes that we should talk about. And I'm looking at this next episode on the list, and I'm just going to put out the name, One Little Ship, Deep Space Nine. Dilithium Crystal, explain yourself. Why is this episode on the list?
Okay, so this one isn't, this was definitely one that I enjoy, not one that I think is meaningful, in case that matters. Okay, so I said I'm a sucker for love stories. I'm also kind of a sucker for silly, campy fun occasionally. And this episode should be hot garbage, honestly. And I guess to some people, maybe it is.
Oh, yeah, there's no question.
I had so much fun watching this episode for the first time. It was just awesome. And I had not seen this one back in the day. I only saw it when I rewatched DS9 in its entirety. And I believe I messaged a friend of mine and I was like, why is this episode not called Honey, I Shrunk the Rubicon? Because that is what this episode should have been titled, 100%. I don't know. It was just a lot of fun to watch, and it stuck in my head. So I guess that's why I put it on the list.
I believe it was actually called that in the pre-production or in the scripts, even though they didn't name it that.
Oh, was it really?
Oh, yeah, for sure. You know, writers, they got to have a sense of humor. They totally did that. By the way, mad shout out for teeny tiny photon torpedoes. Totes awesome.
Oh my gosh, they're so cute. I couldn't. This episode, it should be awful and fully unwatchable. But honestly, as silly as the conceit is that they have this tiny little Rubicon flying around, I loved every minute of it. So, people can shout at me on Twitter about how silly I am for liking it, but I think it's great.
Hey, there are no wrong answers on the Trek Profiles podcast. We take that as one of our rules, just like our friend Jim Morehouse taught us over at Trek Ranks, right? No wrong answers. So that's fine. But one of the things that jumped out at me is, I'm doing a Deep Space Nine rewatch as we record this, and I put out on Twitter that I was starting it whenever that was, and people were tweeting at me as I was moving through the episodes. They said, oh, wait till you get to Move Along Home. Please register your opinions about what a horrible episode it is and how terrible it is and how you felt about how terrible it was. And I don't know if I'm just contrary or whatever, but when I was watching it, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I thought it was just so much fun. And here we have these aliens who show up on the space station, and they're like, yeah, I don't really want to know about the Federation or the Starfleet or any of that stuff or diplomacy. I just want to play games. And it just had a playfulness about it that I'll forgive a lot if it just comes to having some joy in the episode. And so I'm right there with you.
I'm definitely the same way, and I think I don't go in with a super critical eye when I watch most Star Trek, especially now as I'm rewatching things. I make sure that, like in my head, I recognize that these were things that were created a long time ago now, 25, 30, if you're talking about the original series, 50 years ago. And so I can't approach this kind of television like I would a modern show. And I think that making sure I have that perspective helps me. But yeah, there are very few Star Trek episodes that I've watched and gone, oh man, I hated that. There have definitely been episodes that I watched and were like, oh, that's problematic, or oh, I didn't, that aspect real bad. But generally, if I kind of consume it as part of a larger whole, I'm less likely to say that I really hate a thing. There are exceptions. Since I'm rewatching Voyager right now, I will say I watched season 2, episode 9, Tattoo, recently, where Chakotay is meeting aliens that are essentially, yeah, basically you find out that the aliens are the spirits that Chakotay's ancestors worshipped, and so essentially it's erasing his true Native American heritage in a way, and that bothered me a great deal. I was like, that seems really, really, really problematic, and I've heard that the way his heritage is handled in a lot of Voyager is not great, so I've kind of tempered my expectations for that stuff going forward, but yeah.
Well, then if you like the joy, you gotta love Trials and Tribulations for sure.
Oh, I love Trials and Tribulations. I do, even though I'm not a TOS gal, seeing the DS9 cast thrust back into one of the TOS episodes, and not to mention the editing and how they did that looks really surprisingly good. And Jadzia's little beehive hairdo. Just love it so much. She's so cute. That, honestly, if I was going to do another Star Trek cosplay, I think Jadzia in her TOS uniform with the beehive would be something I could probably pull off. I'm getting better at, I'm doing a Star Trek Adventures RPG game with some friends online once a month. And my character is a Trill, and even though we aren't streaming the play online anywhere, we are doing it through Skype with video, and I've been drawing on my Trill spots every month, so I'm getting better at that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear about the amazing coincidence that led to the production of that episode? I mean, this is like one of the top Star Trek stories ever. It's just amazing. I
have not heard it, so I'd love to.
So Ira Behr, who was one of the showrunners for Deep Space Nine, or the showrunner, however it was set up, they had this idea for this episode and they were thinking about it, but there was a lot of production problems. I mean, as a technical achievement, producing this show was really hard.
Okay.
And they're sitting in this pizza place, and they're having this conversation like, oh, I don't know if we could do it. I mean, what, we need to get some of the original actors back, but what if they're not available? And, it would be so hard, and so forth and so on. And they're sitting in the pizza place, and Ira Behr looks across the room and he sees Charlie Brill, the actor who portrayed Arnie Darvin in the original 60s show, is in the pizza place having lunch at that exact moment, which is crazy when you think about it.
You've got to be kidding me.
And so he's sitting there and he's like, well, I got to go talk to him. I got to go over there and talk to him and see if he'll do it, which is not the way these things are done. Normally, you got to go through an agent. The agent presents it to the talent, so it was kind of a breach of protocol, but it just was too weird that the guy was sitting right there while he's sitting with the producers or other writers or whoever it was, having this conversation. And he talked to him right there in the pizza place. The guy agreed to do it. He was still working, and it just worked out, and they made this episode, and it was just fantastic. It was all because of this weird coincidence that the guy happened to be sitting in the same restaurant having lunch at the same time, which is just crazy when you think about it.
Oh, how funny. It's really neat. And I honestly, I really like a lot of the episodes and movies where there have been crossover between casts and stories. I think that those are some interesting moments because it helps people remember that, each show of Star Trek is connected to the others in some ways. And while they do tend to live in their own individual bubbles most of the time, it's neat to see the crossover.
That's amazing. It's just amazing. And the stars crossed and the actors were available and the technology was available for them to be able to produce this episode. So it's just fantastic.
That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. And when you know all the background, it makes watching that episode an even richer meal. So, it's wins all around.
For sure.
Crystal, nobody goes to a Star Trek convention, tweets with other people about Star Trek, if Star Trek isn't meaningful to them in some way. And I think we should move into that part of the conversation. So tell me in what ways you feel that Star Trek has influenced your life in some way.
Star Trek has actually been a pretty big part of my life. And it's interesting because like I've told you, there's a lot of aspects of Star Trek that I haven't consumed as far as like the different shows and other things like that. But Star Trek has always been there, and it's always been an active part of my life. It's interesting. My relationship with Star Trek hasn't always been good per se. For instance, my father is who introduced Star Trek to me, and my relationship with him has not always been great. But Star Trek has also led to some really cool moments for me personally. I didn't realize that I was bisexual until I was in my 20s, and then getting to see characters on screen like Jadzia Dax, who, while not explicitly bisexual because of the whole, like, her prior hosts were men and so on and so forth, she was essentially the best bisexual representation that Star Trek had had up to that point. And there have been other LGBTQ characters now that have come into the world of Star Trek, most notably through Discovery with Stamets and Culber. And I think for me, as a woman and a woman who isn't straight, getting to see myself in media hasn't always been easy. And especially in Star Trek, when I was younger, the only real strong female characters in Next Generation weren't characters that I resonated with really at all. I like Troy and Crusher quite a bit, but I didn't really see myself in either of them. And so while I enjoyed Next Generation, I wasn't able to connect to it on quite as deep a level. Whereas when I watch something like DS9 or now Discovery, it gives me a larger bridge to the content itself. And it's more meaningful to me because I can see aspects of myself in it in ways that I wasn't able to in the past. And this feeds into a larger conversation about why representation in media is so important for underrepresented demographics. And I am one of those people that will, kind of endlessly not argue, but discuss with people online about why it's so important that things like Black Panther exist now. And generally, the only people that are usually arguing with me happen to typically be, middle-aged white men. And it's really hard because I want to sometimes just yell, like, you've always had yourself to look at in media. And I want to tell people to take a step back and realize that your experience is so different from most other people's experiences, and let them have those moments. If you're telling them that you want them to connect with Iron Man or Spider-Man. I'm using only superheroes as a reference, I guess, maybe just because Infinity War came up recently and that it was still in my brain. But it's so neat that more people are able to have stronger connections to media, both movies, TV shows, other things like that. And it makes me so mad when people say that that's not a good thing, or the only reason that people are making content like that is because of the quote unquote PC police or, social justice warriors. And that's the only reason things like that exist. And it's so not true. And it seems so obvious to me that it kind of is confusing that other people can't see it too. But I have to realize that really they don't understand. If they've been able to see themselves in media forever, maybe it is difficult for them to realize how big of a deal it is that characters like Black Panther exist, and why having strong female characters in a movie is a powerful and important thing, and why having different sexual orientations represented in media is important to people like me. I happen to be married to a man, so I think a lot of people often probably assume that I am straight, and that doesn't necessarily bother me. I'm not going to go out of my way to proclaim to everyone, about my sexuality, but I assume most people just assume I'm a very vocal ally, which honestly, that's fine. But I think that now more than ever, it's important for people who feel comfortable speaking up and say, telling people who are doing the wrong thing that they're doing the wrong thing, and that people should use their voices to lift people up and to support diversity and representation. And Star Trek is doing a really, really good job of coming into the modern age in that way. And I imagine that's definitely because the showrunners, Gretchen Berg and Aaron Harberts, are big proponents of that. Aaron Harberts is gay, and I know that Brian Fuller is as well, and he was the original showrunner. So I'm happy that they've included aspects of that in, honestly, what feels like a seamless way. You know, the very first big scene with Stamets and Culber in Discovery was them in the bathroom brushing their teeth together. And that was, to me, a really brilliant choice, because they wanted to display that they were in a relationship, and they didn't have to do it in some weird overt way. Like, you know, when you see them brushing their teeth together that they're in a relationship, but they don't have to tell you that. They just showed it. And I think it was beautiful. And I think the way their relationship progressed in Discovery was really interesting, and especially getting to hear the backstory of how they got together. I was a little devastated when Culber was killed, and I know that the showrunners and the actor who plays Culber have all said, trust us, there's more stuff coming, it's fine, everything's fine. And I would like to trust them that is the case. I don't believe that they're trying to trick us in any way, shape, or form. But it still hurt to see, like, the very first true LGBT couple in Star Trek get ripped away from one another so quickly. And not to mention that, you know, Culber also not white, so there's some of the diversity on the show that gets lost in his death as well. And there's a lot of other diverse characters, which is awesome, but just losing one of them is tough. So I hope that Culber isn't gone in the context of the show as a whole. Whether they made the right decision or not, I can't say, because we're only one season in. I know it broke my heart a little bit. But I'm going to hope that things will be good going forward, and they're going to do something really interesting with it. But I've rambled on quite a bit.
That's okay. No worries. There's a couple things I want to press you on. And I always say this, not because I want to just challenge you or be contrary, but because I really want to get to the core of why it matters. So I want to put some tough questions to you to see if we can get to the truth of something here.
Okay.
So the first issue is that in a show that is so heavily diverse, like Discovery is, where the percentage of diverse characters is so high, that if they kill anybody, it, by almost definition, has to be one of the diverse characters, right? I mean, it's just, there's not a lot of cis white dudes to choose from. How would you respond to that?
That's a good point. And they have made the cast so diverse that, you almost, it would be difficult not to lose someone who's representative of some kind of population. So that makes sense.
All right, Crystal. So for this next question, how do I want to formulate this? You've talked in your answer about why representation matters and why it's important to you. There's a presumption that underlies it that what portrays in media, Star Trek in this particular case, that actually matters, and that how these characters are portrayed and the kinds of characters that are portrayed actually matters and has an influence on the world in some way. How do you think Star Trek will actually impact the world by having that representation? Discovery in particular.
I mean, I think Star Trek has already impacted the world in that way. It's interesting. The information I'm about to present, I learned through the television show Drunk History. So shout out to Drunk History for teaching me things. But I watched the episode about Nichelle Nichols in the original series, and she was going to quit Star Trek because I don't remember exactly the reason, but she was going to quit. And Martin Luther King Jr. came to her and said, "I'm a huge fan of yours. And your show is one of the only shows I'll let my kids watch because, there's a black woman on television who isn't a secretary or in some other subservient position. You're one of the bridge members. You're part of the crew. You're an important character. And that's important to me." And she was going to quit. And she, as a result of that conversation and some others, decided to stick with it. And then she ended up helping recruit the first black woman to go into space. And I apologize if I'm mixing up the details a little bit, but she definitely was.
Are you talking about Mae Jemison?
Yes, I believe she was part of Mae Jemison's getting into NASA, because people had come to her and said, "Hey, we want, we need more people to get into NASA. We want you to help us do that. And she did. And since it's funny, my knowledge is based on drunk history. So of course I got the drunken version of all of this information from that TV show. But she helped recruit people that worked behind the scenes at NASA as well. And if Star Trek didn't exist, then it's possible those things wouldn't have happened. And that's kind of crazy. They broke the barrier with the first interracial kiss on the original series. And if that hadn't happened, what would have been different on television on other shows after that point? So I think right from the get-go, 50 years ago, Star Trek has been influencing the world in tangible ways. And I think all it takes is one show to do it, to help others feel less scared, especially when it comes to like large networks or large companies, things like CBS or Paramount or other things like that. I think they often tend to be a little bit more hesitant to do things that are not the norm or are not outside of the box, even if they feel like the right thing to do, because they do know that there will be backlash. There's always going to be people who are going to fight against something that isn't the norm. It doesn't matter how right, in theory, the thing is to do. And once one person does it, more people can do it without fear. And Star Trek has been pushing boundaries in a lot of ways. I'd say they're a little bit behind on the LGBTQ representation. There's a lot of other shows that have done that in the past, but it broke ground in other ways. And so I think Star Trek needs to be alongside those other shows at this point, just continuing to not even add diversity for diversity's sake, but just show a future where not just different types of humans or aliens or whatever, but where everybody is just equal. And there's still going to be conflict, there's still going to be problems, but where the things that theoretically shouldn't matter really won't matter anymore. Whether you are Geordie LaForge and you're blind, or whether you are in a wheelchair, or whether your skin color is different, assuming that you can do a job, none of the other stuff should matter. And I'd like to think that Star Trek is helping show us a future where that is possible, and maybe helping us get there in some small way. I mean, obviously, if you look at where even specifically America was 50 years ago regarding race especially, while we definitely still have work to do in a number of ways, we've made a lot of progress. And I think that Star Trek is part of that.
Crystal, I thought that was a beautiful and passionate and thoughtful response, for sure. Let me offer this provocation, see how you respond to it. And how shall I go about this? Given where society was in the 60s, TOS pushed the envelope a certain number of standard deviations away from where society was, with its integrated crew of different races and different genders and things. And now in 2017, as Discovery Season 1 first came out, do you feel that Discovery is pushing the envelope less than, about the same, or further than TOS did, given the starting positions of society at the time the show aired?
That's actually a really interesting question, and I haven't really considered it. It's hard to compare it just against the original series. I think for me, the LGBT aspect of Discovery is what I would immediately compare to the racial aspect of the original series, but I don't think Discovery is pushing television as a whole as far as the original series did, but I think it is pushing Star Trek and maybe sci-fi as a whole a little bit, well, not more than it's hard to say, honestly. I think sci-fi television specifically has struggled with some aspects of, especially female characters, LGBT, things like that. A lot of stereotypes, especially involving female characters, have kind of been pervasive in other sci-fi fandoms and series. Star Wars, while I love it, the female characters in Star Wars are often not the best, or there aren't very many of them. Leia kind of is a really cool example of a character that has always been strong, but the portrayal of Leia has gotten better over the years, especially most recently, Carrie Fisher, really did a good job of portraying a kick-butt lady who wasn't going to take any crap from anybody. But in those original movies, there are moments where Leia is kind of relegated to scenery, so to speak. And it's sad, even though they've given her that character some strength and some gumption in some of the other scenes. Yeah, I don't think Discovery is pushing the envelope as much as the original series, but I don't mean that to be a criticism. I don't think Discovery needs to push the envelope as much. But I think that, yeah, they've got strong women and they've got a wider variety of gender representation than anything else. And yeah, the LGBTQ characters are great as well.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you feel that maybe it doesn't have the ability to push things as far because it's a streaming show and it's not on mass broadcast? Do you feel that's a part of it? I mean, if you write the most representation positive show in the world and you stick it in a drawer and no one ever sees it, right, then obviously it can't matter. And because of the fact that Discovery's behind a paywall, it's not as discoverable, to use a pun there. Sorry, I apologize. That it limits how powerful any representation can be in the show because it's not out in the mass market. How would you respond to that?
You know what? I don't know. Maybe. I do really wish that Discovery were on either network or cable television available to a more wide audience, because I think that there are a lot of people who potentially have never watched Star Trek before who would really love Discovery for a number of reasons. So yeah, I think its reach has been stifled by the fact that it's behind a paywall, and I recognize some of the reasons as to why CBS did that. And obviously, they made a lot of money with their streaming platform by putting Discovery on it. But I would imagine that most people, myself included, canceled their membership after the season ended, because I'm not going to pay every month for a service that I'm not using, and they're not giving me a reason to use it other than when Discovery is airing. So I'd say, yeah, its reach probably has been hindered. But I'd also say as far as media representation is concerned, that we've come a long way since the original series aired. And so there's, hopefully for good reason, less envelope pushing to be done at this point. And that's not to say that we're where we should be, but I don't think they need to push it as far because we've come to the point where we are. But I imagine some people might disagree with me on that, and I'd be willing to reevaluate my position. The reach is hindered, and there isn't as much to push for good reason. For representation to matter, people have to be there to consume it, right? And I think that's what we're getting at here, yeah? And if it's behind a paywall, that limits the accessibility of the show to people who might need to see it, and probably caters more to the audience of people who are interested in that because they have to make a positive decision to go see it. It's not as discoverable in some ways because it's not part of mass broadcast. Right. And I think a lot of people kind of have preconceived notions about Star Trek, for whatever reasons. It's interesting. I think growing up, I've always been a nerd or a geek or whatever you want to call it. But when I was younger, I definitely kind of didn't embrace that aspect of my personality as much as I wish I had. And that's because of the culture that I grew up in. Nerds were not cool at all. And I think, and I am not, a young person anymore, but it feels like society, at least in America, has kind of recognized that being nerdy or geeky isn't quite as bad as they thought it was, 20, 30 years ago. And so I think nerds are definitely cooler. Liking things like Star Trek isn't quite as out there as it once was, but yet somehow the stigmas of these older shows are still a little bit pervasive. So I think people are going to be like, oh, Star Trek, yeah, no, I don't do that. Whereas, maybe you should. Although I will admit the new movies that have come out over the past 10 years or so, I think have helped with that a little bit. I had friends that went and saw, Star Trek, the movie in 2009, who had never watched Trek before. And they specifically sought me out after the fact to say, hey, I saw that Star Trek movie. It was really good. That was really cool. And honestly, it made me feel really good that people were enjoying Star Trek, because I have to imagine that people just think it's not for them. when I really truly believe that there's an aspect of Star Trek that could touch just about everybody if they gave it the opportunity.
Nerds are taking over the world.
They really are. And it helps that like the tech boom happened and we're where we are technology wise, because you almost in a way have to be nerdy to enjoy working in some of the fields that are technology based at this point. But really, like, media wise, you don't have to be nerdy. So I don't know. I'm just happy that I can be who I am at this point and be proud about it, and, you know, wear my Batleth earrings and get compliments from strangers about them and be proud to tell them, oh yeah, these are, you know, Klingon weapons. And they'll be like, Klingons? Oh, that's from Star Trek. And I don't have to worry about how they'll perceive me as a person. And that's part of me, you know, growing up and learning to appreciate who I am. I think we all had doubts about who we were when we were teenagers and young adults. And I, at a certain point, just recognized that I am who I am and I really like who I am. So I'm going to just live my life without trying to hinder my own personality. And I not everybody likes me. I think a lot of people do, but I'm a little bit crazy and talkative and sometimes speak my mind in times that I shouldn't, which is why I think I resonate with Tilly so much, because she occasionally lets things slip that maybe she should have just, you know, kept in her head. So I see a lot of myself in her in that way. But yeah, nerds are definitely inheriting the earth. Everybody should hop on.
Now, Crystal, I have to tell you that I've enjoyed our conversation immensely. But the M5 is now signaling me that it is time for the Kobayashi Maru.
Okay.
It is a challenging and difficult test cunningly prepared by the M5 for you. Should you not only survive the test, but pass it as well, the M5 will award you an honorary Star Trek title. Are you ready, Crystal?
I am ready.
M5, load the Kobayashi Maru simulation and prepare to record Crystal's responses.
Working. Simulation loaded and ready for use.
Question 1. You're about to graduate Starfleet Academy. You can request a slot at Deep Space Nine or on the Enterprise D. What do you ask for?
Enterprise D.
Question 2. You're at a restaurant on some well-deserved shore leave. You need a little caffeinated pick-me-up, but they only have 2 caffeine drinks on the menu, Roctagino and the Vulcan Mocha. What do you have?
Roctagino.
Question 3. You've won a spin at the Dabo tables. Congratulations! You can take your winnings either as 10,000 Issex or 10 bars of gold-pressed latinum. Which one do you take?
Gold-pressed latinum.
Question 4. Your personal replicator is broken. Oh no! You can take it either to Chief O'Brien or to B'Elanna Torres to get it fixed. To whom do you take it?
B'Elanna Torres.
Question 5. You are considering a serious life change. To help think through this life change and what it will mean, you want to undergo a ritual. Will it be the Kolinar, the purging of all emotion in the hopes of becoming a being of perfect logic surrounded by stoic, meditating Vulcans who chant a lot? Or will you undergo the Klingon rite of ascension, where you will be tormented by waves of angry Klingons with pain sticks?
Kolinar.
Simulation complete, M5. Please compute the results and tell us if Crystal has passed the Kobayashi Maru simulation.
Working. Results analyzed and displayed.
Crystal, I'm pleased to tell you that the M5 has calculated that you have not only survived the Kobayashi Maru simulation, but you have passed it as well. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now the M5, who has analyzed your answers, will award you an honorary Star Trek title on behalf of our podcast. M5, what title shall we award our guest?
Crystal is awarded the title of Director of Visitor Amusements for the planet Risa.
Ooh, how exciting.
Crystal, please tell people how they can get in touch with you.
So yeah, if I guess we didn't even touch on the fact that I have a board game podcast and I do play a lot of Star Trek themed board games. So if anyone at STLV wants to play a game and you want it to be Star Trek themed or not, I'm definitely the gal to talk to. So I am one of the 2 co-hosts of Board Game Blitz, which is a bi-weekly podcast where we talk all about board games. And I also have an etymology segment on that show as well. So that ties back into my love of etymology that we discussed earlier. You can most easily reach me on Twitter. My handle is at Crystal Pisano, my full name. But yeah, my display name is Dilithium Crystal, as John mentioned earlier. And if you want to connect with my podcast, it's at Board Game Blitz on Twitter. Feel free to message me on either one of those accounts. And I'm always up to talk Trek or board games or anything else. If you follow my main account on Twitter, it's definitely like 40% board games, like 30% Star Trek, and then like the other 30% is, you know, me yelling at people being awful on the internet, and and also pictures of my dogs, because I have three dogs. So
Crystal, thank you so much for being a part of the Trek Profiles podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was my pleasure, and I'm very honored to be on episode 5 of your awesome show.
Here ends this installment of the Trek Profiles podcast. And before we offer a Trek quote to close this episode, I'd like to remind you that you may send us your thoughtful feedback, angry missives, love poems for the M5, or your thoughts on the important Hosperat spice issue to feedback@trekprofiles.com, or on Facebook or Twitter at Trek Profiles. Anything you send us may be used in the show, or it may be lost in a temporal causality loop. This week, I leave you with a quote from Captain Picard, who, as Kamen, said to his daughter, quote, "Seize the time, Maribor. Live now. Make now always the most precious time. Now will never come again." End quote. Thanks for listening, and live long and prosper.